The earth tasted of alkali and dried blood. It was the only thing Clara had known for the last 10 miles, a bitter dust that coated her tongue and filled the cracks in her lips. The sun was a white hammer beating against the anvil of the high plains, relentless and indifferent to the girl dragging herself through the sagebrush. She had lost one shoe miles back, sucked into the mud of a drying creek bed, and the other she'd kicked off in a fit of feverish desperation. Now, the soles of her feet were raw meat, leaving a faint, erratic trail of red on the hard-packed dirt of the cattle trail. She did not know where she was going. She only knew what lay behind her: the memory of the wagon, the smell of stale tobacco and sour sweat. The heavy hand of the merchant who had claimed her debt was his to collect in flesh. He had called it justice. He had called her a thief. The accusation had been a lie, a silver watch planted in her sewing basket. But in a town where a woman without family was little more than property, the truth held no weight. She had run while he slept, stealing nothing but her own bruised body and the tattered gray dress clinging to her frame. Her knees gave way. The impact jarred her spine, but she did not have the strength to cry out. The world tilted sideways, the blue of the sky smeared with the brown of the earth. A buzzard circled high above, a patient speck of darkness waiting for the inevitable. Clara closed her eyes, pressing her cheek against the grit. The heat radiating from the ground felt like a physical weight, pressing the life out of her. She thought of her mother's grave in Ohio, of the cool green grass, and wondered if dying felt like this. Just a long, hot slide into silence. The vibration came first, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the earth against her ear. It grew steady, heavy and distinct. Hoofbeats. Not the frantic gallop of a pursuit, but the slow, plodding walk of an animal burdened and unhurried. Clara tried to push herself up, panic flaring in her chest like a dying ember fanned by wind. If it was him, if it was the merchant, she would force him to kill her. She would not go back to the wagon. She clawed at the dirt, her fingers finding purchase on a dry root. But her arms trembled and collapsed. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the sun. The silence that followed was absolute. The crickets seemed to hold their breath. Even the wind died down. Clara forced one eye open, squinting against the sudden shade. A horse stood there, a massive roan beast with legs like tree trunks, laden with canvas sacks that smelled of wool and raw salt. And atop the horse sat a mountain of a man. From her angle on the ground, he looked impossible. A figure hewn from the rock of the canyon walls. He wore a battered, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his face in shadow. His shoulders were broad enough to block the light, covered in a canvas duster that had been bleached by years of sun and stained by miles of road. He did not speak. He did not draw a weapon. He simply sat there, looking down at the broken thing in the road. Clara tried to speak, to beg him to leave her or to kill her quickly, but her throat was so dry it made only a rasping, clicking sound. She flinched as the leather of his saddle creaked. The man swung his leg over the horn and dropped to the ground. The earth seemed to shake when his boots hit the dust. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, towering well over 6 feet, with a beard that grew wild and dark, streaked with premature gray. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. He approached her not like a predator, but like a man approaching a spooked calf stuck in a ravine. Clara scrambled backward, her heels scraping uselessly against the dirt. A whimper escaped her lips. The man stopped. He crouched down, resting his forearms on his thighs. His eyes were visible now, beneath the brim of his hat. They were gray, the color of a storm cloud before the rain breaks. And they held no cruelty. They held no pity, either. Just a deep, quiet recognition of a fact. "You are dying," his eyes seemed to say. He reached for a canteen slung across his shoulder. He uncorked it, the sound of the damp stopper loud in the stillness. He took a sip himself first, then extended it toward her. He did not shove it at her face. He held it out, waiting. Clara looked at the water, then at him. Thirst won out over terror. She lunged forward, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the tin vessel. He did not let go. his large, calloused hand steadying it as she drank greedily. Water spilled down her chin, washing away streaks of dust. "Slow," he said. His voice was a rumble, deep enough to vibrate in her chest. It sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground, or you will sick it up. She stopped, gasping for air, clutching the canteen like a lifeline. When she was finished, he capped it and hung it back on his belt. Then, without a word of explanation or inquiry, he moved toward her. Clara froze, bracing for violence. Instead, he stooped and scooped her up into his arms. She gasped, her body stiffening. She weighed nothing to him. He held her easily, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back, lifting her high into the air. He smelled of pine needles, horse sweat, and old leather. He carried her to the roan mare and deposited her in the saddle. Before she could sway or fall, he swung up behind her, his chest a solid wall against her back. He reached around her, not to hold her, but to take the reins. He unbuttoned his duster and pulled the heavy canvas flap around her shivering, sun-scorched body, cocooning her against him. "Rest," he said. He kicked the horse into a walk. They left the trail, turning toward the rising slopes of the mountains, and Clara, exhausted beyond the capacity for fear, let her head fall back against the stranger's shoulder and slipped into the dark. The ride was a blur of heat and motion. Time lost its shape, dissolving into the rhythm of the horse's gait. Clara floated in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she was back in the merchant's wagon, feeling the suffocating closeness of the canvas walls. Sometimes she was a child again, sewing by the firelight while her mother hummed a hymn. Mostly, there was just the heat and the silent presence behind her. The man did not speak. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who had bruised her face or why she was barefoot in the wilderness. He simply rode. When the sun beat down too hard, he adjusted his hat to shade her face. When she moaned in her sleep, tossing her head, he steadied her with a hand on her arm. His grip firm but never tightening into a squeeze. They climbed higher. The air grew thinner and cooler. The smell of sage gave way to the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth. The landscape changed from flat, desolate scrubland to steep ridges of granite and forests of dark timber. By the time the horse stopped, the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Clara roused herself, blinking against the twilight. They were in a high valley, a bowl of green grass sheltered by towering cliffs. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin built of rough-hewn logs, sturdy and squat. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. The man slid off the horse and reached up for her. Clara's legs were numb, her body aching in every joint. As she slid into his arms, pain shot up her feet, and she cried out, a sharp, jagged sound. He carried her to the door, kicked it open, and stepped inside. The cabin was warm. It smelled of cured meat and dry wood. It was sparse, containing only the necessities of survival, a cast-iron stove that radiated heat, a table scrubbed white with sand, a single chair, and a bed in the corner covered in a buffalo robe. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness anywhere. But it was clean. The floorboards were swept, and the tin plates on the shelf were stacked in precise order. He set her down on the single chair. Clara gripped the seat, her knuckles white. She watched him as he moved around the room. He lit a kerosene lamp, the golden light pushing back the shadows. He added wood to the stove. He filled a pot with water from a bucket and set it to boil. Every movement he made was efficient. He wasted no energy. He was a man who had lived alone for a long time. She could tell by the way he occupied the space. Silent and self-contained. He approached her then, kneeling on the floorboards. He reached for her foot. Clara jerked her leg back, tucking it under the chair. "No," she whispered. He stopped. He did not reach again. He looked up at her, his face illuminated by the low light of the lantern. The gray eyes were calm. "Your feet are cut," he said. "They will rot if I do not clean them." He waited. He was giving her a choice. It was a small thing, but to Clara, who had spent the last 3 months having choices stripped away one by one. It felt enormous. She looked at his hands. They were large, scarred, and stained with the work of the day, but they lay open on his knees. She slowly extended her leg. He took her foot in his hand. His touch was calloused and rough, like sandpaper, but his grip was incredibly gentle. He examined the raw soles, the cuts from the rocks, and the blisters. He took a cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and began to wash away the blood and dirt. Clara hissed through her teeth as the cloth touched a deep gash. The man paused, waiting for her to settle, then continued. He worked with the focus of a craftsman. He fetched a small jar of salve that smelled of turpentine and bear grease and applied it to the wounds. He tore strips of clean white cotton, cloth that looked like it might have been a flour sack once, and bound her feet. When he was finished, he stood up, looming over her again. "I have stew," he said, "and bread." He ladled a bowl of thick broth, heavy with chunks of venison and potato, and set it on the table before her. He placed a heel of dense, dark bread beside it. Then, instead of sitting with her, he took his own bowl and walked to the window, eating while standing up, staring out into the darkening valley. Clara ate. She had not realized how hungry she was until the salt and fat hit her tongue. She scraped the bowl clean. When she was finished, she watched him. He was terrifying in his size, a giant of a man who could snap her neck with one hand, but he had carried her for hours without saying a word. He had washed her feet. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned from the window. "Elijah," he said, "I am Clara." He nodded once, as if filing the information away, and turned back to the night. Days bled into nights. Clara lost track of how long she'd been in the cabin. The fever broke on the second day, leaving her weak and hollowed out. Elijah built a cot for her near the stove, stringing canvas between 2 wooden frames. He gave her a blanket made of heavy wool. She began to call him the giant in her mind. It fit him. He moved through the world as if he were made of heavier stuff than other men. He chopped wood with a rhythmic, terrifying power, the axe splitting logs in a single stroke. He carried buckets of water from the creek 2 at a time, the muscles in his arms shifting like coiled ropes under his shirt. But inside the cabin, he was a ghost. He made almost no noise. He would enter a room and she would not know he was there until she saw his shadow. He never touched her without asking. If he needed to check her bandages, he would point to her feet and wait for her nod. If he needed to pass by her in the narrow space between the table and the stove, he would flatten himself against the wall to ensure they did not brush against one another. Clara watched him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She knew men. She knew the way they looked at her, the way their eyes lingered on the curve of her hip or the line of her neck. She knew the false kindness they offered when they wanted something. The merchant, Mr. Henderson, had been kind at first. He had found her in Abilene, weeping on the steps of the boarding house where she had been turned out. He had offered her work, a seamstress. He had said, "I travel the territories. Ladies out west pay good money for a dress made by a woman with city hands." She had believed him. She had climbed onto his wagon with her sewing box in a heart full of gratitude. It had taken 2 weeks for the kindness to rot. First, it was a hand on her shoulder that lingered too long. Then, it was the questions about her virtue. Then, the accusation. He had claimed she stole $20 from his lockbox. He told her the law would hang her, or worse. He told her the only way to work off the debt was to be grateful, to be compliant. She had fought him. That was when the striking started. Clara sat by the window of Elijah's cabin, stitching a tear in his spare shirt. She paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. Her hand trembled. She could still feel the phantom weight of Henderson's body, the smell of his onion-tinged breath. She looked up. Elijah was sitting at the table, cleaning a rifle. It was a long, heavy weapon, darker than the night outside. He disassembled it with blind familiarity, oiling the metal, checking the spring. His eyes were focused, intense. There was a storm in those eyes, a turbulence that never seemed to settle, even when his face was stone. He looked up and caught her staring. Clara flinched, expecting anger, expecting him to ask what she was looking at. Elijah held her gaze for a second, then looked back down at the rifle. The mechanism clicked softly as he slid the bolt back into place. He did not ask about her past. He did not ask why she flinched. He simply left her space, a vast, silent territory where she could exist without having to explain her pain. The weather turned. The autumn sun, which had been warm and golden, vanished behind a wall of slate-gray clouds. The wind shifted, coming down from the high peaks with a bite that cut through the chinking of the logs. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Elijah kept the stove fed, but the cold was insidious. It seeped up through the floorboards and radiated from the single pane of glass in the window. Clara lay on her cot, wrapped in the wool blanket and her thin dress. She was shivering. Her teeth chattered, a small, pathetic sound in the darkness. She curled into a ball, trying to preserve her body heat. But the cold was inside her now, settling in her bones. She heard Elijah shift in his bed across the room. The buffalo robe rustled. She squeezed her eyes shut. She could not ask. She would rather freeze than ask a man for anything. But the cold was painful. It felt like the merchant's fingers, pinching and bruising. She shook violently, her breath coming in short, rattling gasps. Clara pushed the blanket aside and sat up. The floor was freezing against her bare feet. She walked across the room, navigating by the faint orange glow of the embers in the stove. She reached the side of his bed. He was awake. She could feel his eyes on her in the dark. "Elijah?" she whispered. He did not move. "Yes, I am cold," she said. Her voice broke. "I cannot stop shaking." He was silent for a long moment. Then he lifted the edge of the heavy buffalo robe. Clara hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed to run. This was the trap. This was the moment the payment would be collected. But she was so cold, and he had not hurt her yet. She climbed into the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but the robe was heavy and incredibly warm. Elijah lay on his back, taking up nearly the entire space. He was radiating heat like a furnace. Clara lay on the very edge of the bed, her back to him, terrified to touch him. She pulled her knees to her chest. "Don't hurt me," she whispered into the darkness. The words were small, fragile things. Elijah shifted. He turned on his side, facing her back. He did not reach for her. He did not pull her close. He simply lay there, his large body a wall between her and the cold air of the room. "I won't," he said. The promise hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Clara lay stiff, waiting. She waited for the hand on her hip. She waited for the shift in breathing. But Elijah simply breathed, steady and deep. Slowly, the warmth from his body began to bridge the gap between them. It thawed the ice in her marrow. Her shivering began to subside. Her muscles, tight as bowstrings for days, began to loosen. She drifted on the edge of sleep, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the solid, unwavering presence of the man behind her. When she woke, the room was filled with a strange, pale light. Clara blinked, confused. She was warm. She was safe. She realized with a jolt that during the night she had rolled backward. She was pressed against Elijah's chest. His arm was draped over her waist, not holding her down, but resting there, heavy and protective. She did not pull away. She lay still, listening. The wind had stopped. The world outside was profoundly silent. She lifted her head slightly to look out the window. Snow was falling. Huge, soft flakes drifted down from a white sky, covering the valley floor, coating the pine trees, burying the world she had run from. It covered her tracks. It covered the trail. It erased the path back to the merchant and the town and the shame. Elijah was still asleep, his breathing a slow rhythm against her back. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel like a hunted thing. She watched the snow fall, burying the past in white silence, and closed her eyes again, letting the warmth take her. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell in heavy, wet sheets that blanketed the valley, turning the world outside the cabin into a featureless expanse of white. The silence was profound, broken only by the settling of the logs and the hiss of sap boiling in the fire. Inside, the world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, a tight, intimate space where Clara and Elijah began to learn the rhythm of one another. Survival in the high country was a conversation spoken in labor. Clara, her feet healing but still tender, found a strange solace in the work. In the mornings, while the sky was still the color of bruised iron, Elijah would bank the fire and head out to the lean-to where the horses were stabled. Clara would limp to the table, her breath pluming in the cold air, and start the coffee. She learned to gauge the temperature of the stove by the smell of the iron. She learned that the water in the bucket needed to be broken off before it could be ladled. When Elijah returned, stomping the snow from his heavy boots, the cabin would be filled with the smell of roasting grain and frying salt pork. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence now, stripped of the sharp edge of fear that had defined her first days. Elijah let her set the pace. He did not hover. He did not offer help unless she struggled, and even then, he would wait for a glance of permission before stepping in. If she dropped a piece of firewood, he would let her pick it up. If she paused while scrubbing the tin plates, lost in a memory that made her eyes go distant and dark, he simply poured himself more coffee and looked at the fire until she returned to herself. He was teaching her, and she realized that she was capable, that she was not broken glass waiting to be swept away. One evening, as the wind howled around the eaves like a dying animal, Clara watched him shave by the light of the lantern. He had a small piece of polished steel he used as a mirror. He worked the blade over his jaw with a steady hand, the scrape of metal on skin the only sound in the room. He had removed his shirt to wash, and the firelight cast deep shadows across his torso. Clara sat on the edge of her cot, a mending basket in her lap. She tried not to stare, but her eyes were drawn to him. He was a landscape of muscle and bone, forged by hard labor. But it was his back that held her attention. When he turned to rinse the blade in the basin, the light caught the ridges of scar tissue that crisscrossed his shoulder blades. They were not the clean, surgical scars of a doctor's knife. They were jagged, ugly things, the marks of fire and shrapnel. Long, pale welts ran down his ribs, interrupting the dark hair that covered his chest and arms. It looked as though the war had tried to chew him up and spit him out, but he had been too tough to digest. "Why do you live up here?" she asked. The question slipped out before she could weigh it. Elijah paused, the razor hovering near his throat. He did not turn around. He rinsed the blade again, the water swirling pink. "It is quiet," he said. "It is lonely," Clara countered. She felt bold tonight, perhaps because the snow made the rest of the world feel 1,000 miles away. "Lonely is better than crowded," he replied. He took a towel and wiped his face, then pulled his woolen undershirt back on, covering the map of violence on his skin. He turned to face her. "The town is full of noise, men talking to hear their own voices. Men want things they have not earned. Up here, the only thing a man has to answer to is the winter." Clara lowered her eyes to her stitching. "Is that why you have not gone back? For supplies?" She saw his boots shift on the floorboards. "We are low on flour," he said, his voice even. "And coffee." She looked up, fear spiking in her chest. The thought of him leaving, of her being alone here, or worse, of having to go with him, made her throat tight. "Are we going?" Elijah studied her. He saw the way her hands had frozen on the needle, the way her breath had hitched. He looked at the door, barred against the wind, and then back at her. "No," he said. "The pass will drift deep. A horse would break a leg. We have dried beans. We have venison. We will make do." The relief that washed over her was so potent it made her dizzy. She nodded, plunging the needle back into the fabric. "We will make do," she echoed. But the confinement brought its own danger. The cabin was small. There was nowhere to go to escape the physical presence of the other. As the days turned into weeks, the air between them grew thick, charged with a static electricity that snapped whenever they drew too close. They brushed against each other near the hearth, her elbow grazing his arm, his hand bumping hers as they both reached for the kettle. Each time, the contact was electric, startling. Clara would pull back, murmuring an apology, and Elijah would go still, his eyes tracking her movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It was not the predatory look she was used to. It was heavier. It was a hunger that had been starved for a decade, disciplined and restrained, but undeniably present. One night, the storm turned violent. Thunder, rare for the season, shook the ground, and the wind shrieked with a voice that sounded almost human. Clara was asleep on her cot, but the noise dragged her into a waking nightmare. In her dream, the wind was the merchant's voice, screaming at her to open the door. The thunder was the sound of his fist hitting the table, the smell of the cabin, pine and wood smoke, twisted into the scent of stale tobacco and fear. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. The cabin was dark, save for the red glow of the stove's belly, but the shadows were alive. They were reaching for her. "No," she whimpered, scrambling backward until her back hit the rough logs of the wall. "Get away! Please, Clara!" Elijah's voice was rough with sleep, coming from the darkness. She did not hear him. She was not in the mountains. She was in the back of the wagon, and the lock was turning. She curled into a ball, covering her head with her arms, sobbing. The sound was raw, a tearing sound that seemed to rip through her throat. There was movement, a heavy shift of weight. And then he was there. He did not grab her. He knelt on the floor beside the cot, his presence a solid barricade against the terrors of the dark. "Clara," he said again, his voice low and grounding. "You are safe. Look at me." She could not stop shaking. She felt as though she were shattering, piece by piece. The hands of the past were all over her. Elijah reached out and took her wrists, pulling her hands away from her face. His grip was firm, anchoring her to the present. She looked at him, her eyes wide and unseeing, tears streaming down her face. He pulled her off the cot and into his lap, sitting back against the frame of the bed. He wrapped his arms around her, engulfing her in his warmth. He rocked her, slowly, the way one might rock a child, though there was nothing paternal in the tension of his jaw. "Breathe," he commanded softly. "Just breathe." Clara buried her face in his shirt, clutching the fabric until her knuckles ached. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was just a dry, heaving shell. Elijah held her through it all, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I am broken," she whispered finally, her voice a cracked ruin. "You are not broken," he rumbled against her hair. "You are hurt. There is a difference." Clara pulled back enough to look at him. Her face was swollen, her eyes red. "No," she said bitterly. "I am ruined. That is what they said. That is all men see when they look at me. Just a thing to be used. A whore." Elijah's hands tightened slightly on her arms. His face was close to hers, the gray eyes fierce in the gloom. "I do not see a whore," he said. "I saw a woman who walked through hell and kept walking. I see more courage in your little finger than I have seen in an entire regiment of men." The intensity of his words stunned her. She looked at his mouth, hidden in the dark beard, and felt a sudden, desperate need to bridge the distance. She needed to know that she could still be wanted, not as a victim, but as a woman. She needed to erase the memory of the merchant's rough hands with something real. She leaned forward, tilting her face up, and pressed her lips to his. For a heartbeat, he froze. His lips were warm and rough. She pressed closer, her hand coming up to touch his neck, seeking a response. Then, gentle as the snowfall outside, he pulled back. He took her face in his large hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. He created a space between them, just inches, but it felt like a canyon. "No," he whispered. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. Shame flooded her, hot and agonizing. She tried to pull away, to retreat into the dark, but he held her fast. "You are not ready," Elijah said. His voice was ragged, straining against his own desire. "I want to," she pleaded. her voice trembling. "I need to know." "You are trying to pay me," he interrupted. "Or you are trying to prove you are not broken. Neither is a reason to kiss me." He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw the struggle there. He wanted her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wanted her so badly his hands were shaking against her skin. But he was refusing to take what she was offering because it was not a gift. It was a sacrifice. "When you come to me," he said, his voice dropping to a growl that vibrated in her bones, "it will not be because you are afraid. It will not be to forget him. It will be because you want me, because you cannot help yourself." He released her face and stood up, lifting her effortlessly back onto the cot. He pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, tucking her in. "Sleep, Clara." He retreated to his own bed, turning his back to the room. Clara lay in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. She touched her lips where he had been. He had rejected her, yet she did not feel rejected. She felt seen. For the first time, her body was not a currency to be traded for safety. It was hers again. The incident changed something fundamental in the cabin. The fear that had defined Clara's existence began to recede, replaced by a curiosity about the man who shared her space. They began to talk, in the long evenings, while the wind battered the walls. Elijah lit a second candle. They sat at the table, nursing cups of weak coffee made from reused grounds. Clara told him about her mother, about the music in the church in Ohio, about the smell of rain on hot pavement. And one night, Elijah spoke of the war. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at his hands, clasped on the table, the knuckles scarred and white. "It was in Virginia," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. 1864. The wilderness. The trees were burning. You could not see the sun because of the smoke. Clara stopped sewing. She watched him, sensing that he was opening a door that had been rusted shut for years. "We were skirmishers," he continued, moving ahead of the line. "I came upon a boy. He could not have been more than 16. He wore gray, but his coat was too big for him. He was trying to reload, but his hands were shaking so hard he dropped the powder." Elijah closed his eyes. "I had my bayonet. I was close enough to smell him. He looked up at me. He dropped his rifle. He put his hands up. He said, 'Please, mister, I want to go home.'" The silence in the cabin stretched, heavy and suffocating. "And," Clara whispered, "and I killed him." Elijah said. He opened his eyes, and they were full of a bleak, ancient winter. "I ran him through because that is what I was trained to do, because he was the enemy. But as he fell, he grabbed my coat. He did not try to fight. He just held on, like he was afraid to fall alone. I watched the light go out of his eyes while the forest burned around us." He unclasped his hands and rubbed his face. "That is why I am here. Clara, I came west to get away from the people who called me a hero. I came here because I did not deserve to live among them. I carry that boy with me, every day." Clara reached across the table. It was a slow, deliberate movement. She laid her hand over his. His skin was rough, his hand twice the size of hers. He went still, looking at her hand, then up at her face. "You are not a monster." "Elijah," she said softly, "you are a man who carries a heavy thing." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. His grip was desperate, holding onto her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. The snow fell heavier, sealing the pass, sealing the valley, sealing them in. There was no world outside the cabin. There was only the fire, the smell of pine, and the two of them. The desire between them became a tangible weight. It was in the way Elijah watched her brush her hair in the mornings. It was in the way Clara's gaze lingered on his forearms when he rolled up his sleeves to chop wood. It was a slow, agonizing burn that made the air in the cabin feel thin and hot. Weeks passed. The isolation stripped away the layers of social pretense. They were simply a man and a woman, existing in the rawest form of humanity. One night, the fire had burned down to embers. The room was bathed in a deep, pulsating red glow. Clara lay on her cot, but sleep was impossible. Her skin felt tight, sensitive to the brush of the wool blanket. She could hear Elijah's breathing across the room, a rhythmic sound that seemed to pull at her own lungs. She sat up. The decision was not made with her mind. It was made by the blood in her veins. She stood and walked across the cool floorboards. She did not stop at the edge of his bed this time. She stood there, looking down at him. Elijah was awake. He lay on his back, his arm thrown over his eyes. He lowered it slowly as he sensed her presence. "Clara," he warned, his voice a low rumble of gravel. "Go back to sleep." "No," she said. She reached down and took the edge of the buffalo robe. She pulled it back. Elijah went rigid. He did not move to make room for her, but he did not push her away. Clara climbed into the bed. She did not lie with her back to him this time. She lay on her side, facing him, the length of her body pressing against his. The heat of him was overwhelming. He was like a furnace. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the heavy muscle of his thigh against hers. "Elijah," she whispered. He groaned, a sound of genuine pain, and turned his head toward her. His eyes were dark pools, searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm not afraid," she said, and then, because she needed to set the terms, because she needed to own this moment, she placed her hand flat on the center of his chest, right over his heart. "Touch me," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. "Touch me, but do not take me. Not yet. I need to learn how to feel you without losing myself." Elijah looked at her for a long moment. The storm in his eyes quieted, replaced by a fierce, reverent focus. He lifted his hand. It was a massive thing, a hand that could crush bone, a hand that had taken life. He brought it to her face. He traced the line of her cheekbone with a touch so light it felt like a ghost. He moved his hand down her neck, over the pulse that hammered there, and rested it on her shoulder. He did not grab. He did not pull. He simply let the weight of his hand rest there, grounding her. He moved lower, his palm sliding over the rough wool of her dress, mapping the curve of her waist, the flare of her hip. He touched her as if she were made of holy glass. He touched her like a prayer. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. A sob rose in her throat, but it was not a sob of sorrow. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Tears leaked from her eyes, sliding hot into her hairline. "Why are you crying?" Elijah whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Because I am here," she choked out. "Because you are touching me, and I am still here." He shifted, pulling her closer until her forehead rested against his chin. His other arm came around her, holding her against the solid wall of his body. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her, soap and woman and resilience. "It hurts," she whispered, clutching his shirt. "It hurts to want this." Elijah's grip tightened, just enough to let her know he would never let her fall. "I know," he said against her skin. His voice was rough with emotion. "It hurts because you are alive. Clara, the dead do not hurt." He pulled back slightly to look at her. His hand moved to her waist, his thumb rubbing slow, soothing circles against her side. "We will go slow," he promised. "We will take all the time the winter gives us. I will not take anything you do not give." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "But I will make you love every inch," he vowed, the words low and fierce in the darkness. "I will make you love yourself again, until there is no room left for the memory of anyone else." Clara closed her eyes, surrounding herself with his heat, his scent, and his promise. The snow piled high against the door, locking them in. But for the first time, she did not feel trapped. She felt found. The thaw arrived not with a roar, but with a rhythmic, relentless dripping. The great white silence that had held the valley in a chokehold for 3 months began to weep. Icicles hanging from the eaves of the cabin, thick as a man's arm, grew slender and translucent before crashing into the slush below. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, cracked open, rushing dark and loud over the stones, carrying the memory of winter down toward the plains. Inside the cabin, the air changed. The desperate, huddling warmth of survival gave way to something lighter, something that smelled of damp earth and pine resin. The confinement that had forced Clara and Elijah into a shared orbit now allowed them to breathe. They moved around each other with a practiced ease, a domestic choreography learned in the dark. Clara stood at the table, her hands dusted with flour, kneading dough for biscuits. The morning sun slanted through the window, catching the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her braid. She was humming. It was a low, unconscious sound, a melody from a hymn she had not thought of in years. Elijah sat by the door, mending a bridle. The leather strip was tough, but he worked an awl through it with steady pressure. He stopped when he heard the sound. He looked up, his hands freezing mid-motion. He watched her back, the sway of her hips as she worked the dough, the way the sunlight turned her neck to gold. She turned to reach for the salt and caught him staring. The humming stopped abruptly. She flushed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said. "You didn't," Elijah replied. He looked down at the leather in his hands, and then, for the first time since he had pulled her from the dust of the road, the corner of his mouth ticked upward. It was not a broad grin. It was a shifting of the beard, a softening of the eyes, a crack in the granite. "Sing it again," he said. Clara hesitated, then turned back to the dough. She began to hum again, louder this time, filling the rough corners of the cabin with a fragile, defiant beauty. Elijah went back to his work, but the tension in his shoulders, usually carried like a loaded pack, was gone. With the snow receding to the high peaks, the world expanded. Elijah decided it was time she learned the land and the creatures that lived on it. He took her out to the corral where the horses had spent the winter chewing on hay and boredom. "This is Mayfly," Elijah said, patting the neck of a sturdy, broad-chested mare. "She is not fast, and she is stubborn, but she will not step in a hole." Clara looked at the animal with trepidation. To Elijah, the horse was a tool. To Clara, it was a beast of burden that stood a full hand taller than her head. "She is very big," Clara noted. "She is strong," Elijah corrected. "Like you." He laced his fingers together to form a stirrup. "Put your foot here." Clara placed her boot in his hands. He hoisted her up with an effortless heave that made her gasp. She scrambled for the saddle horn, clutching it with white-knuckled desperation. The ground seemed alarmingly far away. Elijah walked beside the mare, his hand resting on Clara's knee to steady her. He led them out of the corral and into the meadow, where the grass was pushing up green through the patches of melting snow. "Loosen your legs," he commanded gently. "You are gripping her like she is going to fly away. You have to move with her." "I am trying," Clara said through gritted teeth. The mare, sensing the anxiety of her rider, decided to test the waters. She dipped her head suddenly to snatch a mouthful of new grass. The reins jerked through Clara's hands. She pitched forward, lost her balance, and slid unceremoniously off the side of the horse. She braced herself for the impact, for the jarring hit of the ground. It never came. Elijah had moved with the speed of a striking snake. He caught her before her boots touched the mud, his arm hooking around her waist, swinging her clear of the horse's hooves. She dangled there for a moment, her feet inches from the slush, held aloft by the giant. She looked up at him, eyes wide with shock. Elijah looked down, his face deadpan. "I told you she was stubborn," he said. A bubble of laughter rose in Clara's chest. It started as a giggle, a nervous release of tension, and then bloomed into a full, bell-like sound. She laughed until she had to hold onto his shoulders to stay upright. It was the sound of a woman remembering what joy felt like. Elijah set her down, but he did not step away. He watched her laugh, and the look on his face was one of wonder, as if he had just witnessed a flower bloom in the middle of a rock slide. "Next time," he said, his voice thick with amusement, "try to stay on the top side of the animal." They spent the next week building a new coop for the 3 hens that had miraculously survived the winter in a crate in the lean-to. Elijah sawed the planks, and Clara hammered them into place. She hit her thumb twice, cursing with a colorful vocabulary that made Elijah raise an eyebrow. "You learned those words in a church?" he asked dryly. I learned them in a boarding house, she retorted, sucking on her injured digit. They worked well together. There was a rhythm to their labor, a passing of tools and a sharing of weight that felt intimate. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting long purple shadows across the valley, they sat on the half-finished structure, drinking water from a ladle. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at Elijah, who was staring out at the tree line. "My name is not Clara," she said. The words hung in the cool air. Elijah turned his head slowly. He did not look surprised. He waited. Clara looked down at her boots. Clara was the name on the paperwork at the boarding house. It was the name the merchant used. It is a good name. It fits who I was then. Scared, small. "And who are you now?" Elijah asked. She looked at him, at the strength in his jaw and the kindness in his storm-gray eyes. "I'm someone who is building a chicken coop in the mountains with a man who catches me when I fall." She paused. "I am not ready to say my real name. Not yet. It feels like if I say it, the wind might carry it down the mountain and they will find me." Elijah nodded. He reached out and covered her hand with his. The roughness of his palm against hers was a grounding force. "Keep it," he said. "Names are power. You give it to me when you are ready to be found. Until then, Clara is enough." The weather turned warm enough to strip away the heavy layers of wool and leather. The river, swollen with meltwater, ran clear and cold over the granite bed. Elijah suggested they wash the winter off. They rowed to a secluded bend in the river, shielded by a thicket of willows and cottonwoods. The sun was high and bright, heating the rocks on the bank. Elijah went downstream, giving her privacy, but the distance between them felt shorter than it ever had. Clara bathed quickly, the icy water making her gasp. She scrubbed her skin with a rough cloth, trying to wash away not just the dirt, but the memory of the last year. She washed her hair, letting it float in the current like dark silk. When she was finished, she dried herself in the sun, shivering and exhilarated. She dressed in her shift in the simple calico dress she had mended a dozen times. She walked downstream to find Elijah. He was sitting waist-deep in a quiet pool, his back to her. He was washing the sweat from his hair. Clara stood on the bank, watching the muscles of his back shift and ripple. The scars were stark in the sunlight, white ridges of tissue that told a story of violence and survival. She stepped onto the rock nearest him. Elijah turned at the sound of her footfall. Water streamed down his beard and chest. He did not cover himself. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and unguarded. Clara sat on the edge of the rock, dipping her feet into the water. She reached out. Elijah went still. She placed her fingertips on the jagged scar that ran from his shoulder to his pectoral muscle. The skin was smooth and raised. She traced the line of it, her touch feather-light. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "Not anymore," he said. His voice was rough. "It is just a memory now." Clara leaned forward. She kissed his shoulder, her lips pressing against the cool, wet skin right over the worst of the scarring. It was a gesture of acceptance, a benediction. Elijah closed his eyes. A shudder went through his massive frame. He reached up and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, his beard ticking her skin. "You are cold," he murmured. "You are warm," she replied. The water swirled around them, cold and ancient, but the heat between them was new and terrifyingly bright. 2 days later, the peace was shattered by a glint of light on the ridge. Elijah was chopping wood, his axe swinging with hypnotic regularity. He stopped mid-swing, the axe head hovering in the air. He lowered it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the skyline. Clara, coming out of the cabin with a basket of laundry, saw him freeze. "What is it?" Elijah did not answer immediately. He watched the distant tree line. There was movement, tiny, distinct shapes against the gray rock. Horses, riders, they were miles away, moving slow, picking their way through the lingering drifts of the high pass. "Get inside," Elijah said. His voice was low, devoid of alarm but heavy with command. Clara dropped the basket. She followed his gaze, squinting, but saw nothing. Elijah grabbed the axe and walked calmly back to the cabin. He leaned the tool against the wall and went straight to the mantel where the rifle hung. He took the weapon down. He sat at the table and pulled out his cleaning kit. He began to sharpen his knife, the stone rasping against the steel with a rhythmic, deadly sound. "Elijah?" Clara's voice trembled. "3 riders," he said, not looking up. "They are scouting the ridge. They will not be here before dark, maybe not until tomorrow. The trail is washed out." "Is it them?" she whispered. Elijah looked at her then. The softness she had seen at the river was gone. In its place was the soldier, the man who had survived the wilderness. "I do not know," he said, "but I will not wait to ask them." Night fell like a shroud. The cabin was dark. The fire banked low to hide the smoke. Elijah sat by the window, the rifle across his knees, watching the trail. Clara sat on the edge of his bed, her hands twisted in her lap. The silence was thick, heavy with the things that had not been said. Elijah turned from the window. The moonlight caught the silver threads in his beard. "Who is looking for you?" "Clara," he asked. It was not an accusation. It was a tactical question. "If I am to fight them, I need to know what they are." Clara took a breath. The truth had been rotting inside her for months, a poisonous secret she had been too ashamed to speak. But looking at Elijah, seeing the way he sat between her and the door, she realized that shame was a luxury she could no longer afford. "His name is Henderson," she said. Her voice was steady, harder than it had been before. "He is a merchant. He travels between the mining camps and the railheads. I worked for him. I mended the canvas covers for his wagons. I sewed dresses for the women in the towns we passed." Elijah waited. "He wanted me to be more than a seamstress," she continued, looking at her hands. "He brought me gifts, cheap things, a comb, a ribbon. When I refused him, he did not get angry. Not at first. He smiled. He told me I would learn gratitude." She swallowed past the lump in her throat. "We were in Abilene. He came to my room. He had a bottle of whiskey. He told me that I belonged to him because he had fed me when I was starving. When I fought him off, when I scratched his face, he did not hit me. He laughed. He called the sheriff. He told them I had stolen a gold watch from his vest. He planted it in my sewing basket." Clara looked up, meeting Elijah's gaze. "The law in that town is bought and paid for. They threw me in a cell. Henderson came to the bars that night. He told me he would drop the charges if I agreed to his terms. He told me exactly what those terms were. He said I was nothing, that no one would miss me, that I was already a whore in the eyes of the town, so I might as well get paid for it." Tears tracked hot lines down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "I picked the lock with a hairpin. I have small hands. I ran until my shoes fell apart. I ran until you found me." Elijah stood up. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not touch her at first. He stood over her, a mountain of shadow and vengeance. He lied. Elijah said. The words were low, vibrating with a fury that made the air shake. He crouched down so he was eye level with her. He took her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped away the tears. "You are not nothing," he said fiercely. "You are the fire in this hearth. You are the only thing in this world that is real." "He is a small man with a small soul, and he tried to break you because he could not own you." Clara sobbed. A single, wrenched sound. "You are not what they say." Elijah vowed. "You are more women than they will ever deserve. You are more than I deserve. But I am the one who found you, and I am the one who is keeping you." The distance between them vanished. Clara lunged forward, throwing her arms around his neck. Elijah caught her, pulling her off the bed and into his lap as he sat back on the mattress. The kiss was not tentative this time. It was desperate. It was a collision of need and fear and defiance. Clara kissed him with all the anger she felt toward the merchant, with all the gratitude she felt toward the giant. Elijah kissed her back with a hunger that had been dammed up for a decade. He laid her back on the buffalo robe. His hands, so often careful and restrained, were everywhere now. He touched her with a reverence that made her weep. He undressed her slowly, pausing to kiss the skin he exposed, worshipping the body she had been taught to hate. When he finally joined his body to hers, it was not a taking. It was a gift. He filled the hollow places in her soul. He moved with a slow, powerful rhythm that demanded everything she had and gave everything he was in return. Clara cried out, her hands gripping his shoulders, her nails digging into the scars. She felt open, raw, and terrified. But beneath the fear was a blinding joy. He whispered her name, the name she had given him, over and over, like a litany against the dark. "You are mine," he groaned against her neck. "You are safe," and for the first time in her life, Clara believed it. She was precious. She was gold in the dirt. She was loved. The morning came too soon. It arrived with a pale, sickly light that washed out the warmth of the night. Clara woke to the sound of Elijah moving. He was already dressed, his boots laced tight. He was standing by the window, the rifle in his hands. Clara sat up, pulling the buffalo robe around her naked shoulders. The memory of the night before flushed her skin, but the look on Elijah's face stopped the words of affection in her throat. "What is it?" she asked. Elijah nodded toward the window. "Look." Clara rose, wrapping the robe tighter, and went to his side. She looked out across the valley. In the distance, near the mouth of the pass where the trail narrowed between two granite walls, a thin gray column of smoke rose into the still air. A campfire. "They are here," Elijah said flatly. "They camped at the ridge line. They will be here by midday." Clara's blood ran cold. The sanctuary of the winter was gone. The world had intruded. "We have to run," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Elijah, we can take the horses. We can go over the north ridge. There is a trail." "No," Elijah said. He turned to her. His face was set in hard lines. He looked like the granite of the mountain itself. "We do not run, Clara. If we run, they will chase us. They will hunt us down like dogs. We will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." "But they will hurt you," Clara pleaded, grabbing his arm. "He will bring men with guns." "Let them come," Elijah said. He placed his hand over hers on his arm. "This is not a wagon on the road. This is not a boarding house. This is my land. I built this cabin. I cleared this valley." He looked deep into her eyes, his gaze anchoring her spinning panic. "We stand our ground," he said. "This is your home now, and I will not let any man take it from you." Clara looked at the smoke rising in the distance, a signal of the violence to come. Then she looked at the giant standing beside her, the man who had washed her feet and worshipped her body. She felt the fear. Yes, but beneath it, she felt something new, a steel spine, a root taking hold. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "We stand." Elijah squeezed her hand, then turned back to the rifle. He racked the bolt, the metallic clack echoing loud in the quiet morning. "Get dressed," he said. "We have work to do." The sun rose over the valley with a deceptive brilliance, painting the granite peaks in shades of rose and gold. But the beauty of the morning was lost on the two figures working near the tree line. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine resin and the metallic tang of gun oil. Elijah moved the earth with the same silent efficiency he applied to everything. He had chosen a narrow choke point in the trail, a place where the path curved sharply around a massive boulder before descending toward the cabin. It was the only approach for a horseman who did not want to risk a broken neck on the scree slopes. He dug a shallow trench, wide enough to snap a foreleg if a horse stepped wrong, but he did not leave it lethal. He filled it with a loose brush and covered it with a thin layer of dirt. It was not a trap meant to kill. It was a trap meant to stop. Clara sat on a flat rock nearby, a box of brass cartridges open in her lap. The Winchester rifle lay beside her, heavy and cold. Her hands, usually steady when pulling a needle through silk or canvas, were trembling. She dropped a cartridge. It hit the rock with a sharp clink that sounded like a scream in the quiet morning. She picked it up, wiping the dust from the lead bullet with her thumb. "I am no good at this," she whispered. Elijah stopped digging. He rested his hands on the handle of the shovel and looked at her. His chest heaved slightly, the only sign of his exertion. "You are doing fine," he said. His voice was low, grounding. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the fear of the previous night having settled into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. They will not just ride away. Elijah, if Henderson is coming, he is coming to take what he thinks he owns. He will have men who do this for money. Elijah resumed digging, the shovel biting into the rocky soil. Then let them earn their money. He finished the trap and smoothed the earth. He stepped back, surveying the ambush point. It was invisible to the untrained eye, a subtle disturbance in the dirt that a galloping horse would never see. He walked over to Clara and took the box of ammunition from her shaking hands. He did not chide her. He simply took a handful of cartridges and began feeding them into the loading gate of the rifle, his thumb pushing them home with a rhythmic click, click, click. He handed the rifle back to her. "If I tell you to shoot," he said, looking deep into her eyes, "you do not look at their faces. You look at the center of their chests, and you pull the trigger until the gun is empty." Clara took the weapon. It felt impossibly heavy, a tool of death in hands that were made for creation. But as she gripped the walnut stock, she thought of the merchant's smile. She thought of the cell in Abilene. She tightened her grip. "I understand," she said. They did not have to wait long. The sun was high, beating down on the valley floor with a white, blinding intensity. When the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, it was a chaotic sound, the clatter of shod hooves on stone, distinct from the natural rhythm of the mountains. Elijah stood on the porch of the cabin. He had not hidden. He stood in plain sight, his long duster brushing his boots, his own rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, half hidden by the shadows, the Winchester clutched to her chest. 3 riders emerged from the timber. Leading them was a man on a sleek black gelding. He wore a suit that had once been fine, but was now coated in the gray dust of the trail. A bowler hat sat low on his forehead, and a gold watch chain glittered across his vest. Even from this distance, Clara recognized the set of his shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his head. Henderson. Flanking him were 2 men who looked like they had been carved from gristle and bad intentions. They wore low-slung holsters and hats battered by years of rough living. Hired guns. Men who sold their morality for $1 a day and whiskey. They slowed as they approached the cabin, their horses blowing hard from the climb. Henderson spotted Elijah and pulled his mount up short, 20 yards out. The 2 hired men fanned out slightly, their hands hovering near their hips. Henderson's eyes scanned the porch, dismissing Elijah almost instantly before locking onto the figure in the doorway. A slow, oily smile spread across his face. "Well now," he called out, his voice smooth and carrying the practiced projection of a man used to haggling. "It seems my little bird found a nest." Clara stepped forward. She felt like she was made of glass, ready to shatter, but she forced her feet to move. She would not hide in the dark. "Get off my land," Elijah said. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the tone of a man telling a dog to sit. Henderson looked at the giant cowboy, his lip curling in distaste. He took in the worn duster, the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, the lack of civilization. "I have no quarrel with you." "Squatter," Henderson said, dismissing him again. "You are harboring a fugitive. That woman is a thief. She stole property from my wagon. Valuable property. And she is under contract to work off her debt." He looked at Clara, his eyes raking over her body with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Come along, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a mock cooing tone. "You have had your little run. These gentlemen are tired. Do not make this difficult, and perhaps I will forget this little excursion." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. The fear was a physical hand around her throat. "She owes you nothing," Elijah said. Henderson laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "She owes me $300. Or she owes me the work, and seeing as she has been warming your bed, I imagine she has learned a few new tricks to pay it down." The insult hung in the air, foul and poisonous. One of the hired men snickered. Elijah moved. It was not a frantic motion. It was a shift in gravity. He stepped off the porch, the rifle shifting from the crook of his arm to his hands in a blur of motion. He did not aim it yet, but the barrel was pointed unmistakably in Henderson's direction. "You have 3 seconds to turn those horses around," Elijah said. His voice had changed. The rumble was gone. It was flat, cold, and terrified no one. It was the voice of the man who had killed a boy in the burning woods of Virginia. Henderson's smile faltered. He looked at the size of the man, at the stillness of him. He looked at the hired men, who had stopped smiling. "Now see here," Henderson blustered, his hand drifting toward the small pistol tucked in his belt. "I have the law on my side. You cannot threaten a man of business." 1, Elijah counted. The hired man on the left, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, spat on the ground. "He's bluffing, Mr. Henderson. A big man like that is slow." Elijah shifted his gaze to the scarred man. The look in his eyes was so devoid of humanity, so utterly empty of hesitation, that the hired man's hand froze inches from his gun. 2, Elijah said. Clara stepped out onto the porch fully. She raised the Winchester. It was heavy, and it wavered, but she pointed it at Henderson's chest. "Go!" she screamed. The word tore out of her throat. "Just go!" Henderson looked at the woman he had branded a victim. He saw the gun. He saw the giant who looked ready to tear the world apart with his bare hands. He was a businessman, and he knew a bad investment when he saw one. He sneered, adjusting his hat. "You think this is over?" he spat, his face twisting into a mask of ugliness. "You think you can just keep her? I will be back. And I will bring the sheriff. We will see how brave you are when there is a noose waiting for you." "Leave," Elijah said, "or I will bury you myself. I have a shovel ready." The threat was specific enough, and delivered with enough conviction, to break the last of their resolve. Henderson yanked his horse's head around. "You will regret this," he shouted over his shoulder. He kicked his horse into a gallop, heading back down the trail. The 2 hired men followed, casting nervous glances back at the giant standing in the yard. They disappeared into the trees. The sound of their retreat faded, leaving only the wind and the pounding of Clara's heart. She stood there for a long moment, the rifle still raised, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Then, the adrenaline crashed. Her knees buckled. The rifle slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the wood of the porch. She sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands. Elijah was there in an instant. He did not care about the rifle. He dropped his own weapon in the dust and scooped her up, pulling her against his chest. He held her while she shook. She did not cry. She was past crying. She was vibrating with a terror that went deeper than bone. "They will come back," she choked out against his coat. "He said he would bring the sheriff. They will hang you. Oh, God. Elijah, they will hang you because of me." "Shh," Elijah soothed, his hand stroking the back of her head. "No one is hanging anyone. We have to leave," she insisted, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were wild. "We have to go now, before they get to town." "No," Elijah said. He held her face, forcing her to look at him. "We are not running. You are not a thing to be taken. Clara, you are not a stolen horse. You are a woman, and we are going to make them see that. But the law is a man," Elijah said, "and men can be reasoned with, or they can be fought. But we do not run from our home." He picked her up, carrying her inside the cabin away from the bright, exposing sun. He sat with her for hours, watching the door, while she slowly pieced herself back together. 3 days passed. They were days of agonizing tension. Elijah did not work the land. He sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle, watching the trail. Clara cooked, but she could not eat. Every snap of a twig, every call of a jay, sent her heart into her throat. When the rider finally appeared, he came alone. He rode a gray mare that looked as tired as he did. He wore a tin star pinned to a brown vest. Sheriff Miller was a man who looked like he had been dried out by the wind like a piece of jerky. He had sad eyes and a mustache that drooped over his mouth. He rode into the yard slowly, his hands clearly visible on the reins. Elijah stood up, but he did not raise his rifle. In the afternoon, the sheriff called out. His voice was gravel and dust. "Sheriff," Elijah acknowledged. Miller stopped his horse and leaned on the saddle horn. "I got a man in town named Henderson. Making a lot of noise. Says you threatened to kill him. Says you are holding a woman against her will. Says she is a thief." Elijah looked at the sheriff. "He says a lot of things." Miller nodded, shifting a toothpick in his mouth. "He does. He is a loud man. But the law is the law, son. If you have got a woman here, I need to speak to her." Elijah did not move. "She is here, but she is not stolen. Let her tell me that." Clara stepped out of the cabin. She had washed her dress and brushed her hair. She was pale, but she stood straight. She walked to the edge of the porch, standing beside Elijah. She felt his presence like a heat source, giving her strength. "I am Clara," she said. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. Miller looked at her. He looked at the bruises that had faded to yellow on her arms. He looked at the way she stood, not cowering, but defiant. "This man says you stole jewelry. Miller says you owe him money. He lies." Clara said. She stepped down one step. "I worked for him," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I sewed for him. He tried to force himself on me in Abilene. When I refused, he had me arrested to scare me. He told me I could rot in jail or I could warm his bed. I ran because I wanted to live. I took nothing but the clothes on my back. I didn't even have shoes when Elijah found me." Miller studied her face. He had been a lawman for 30 years. He knew what a liar looked like. Liars looked down. Liars fidgeted. This woman looked him in the eye with the desperate honesty of the damned. He looked at Elijah. "And you? You just found her?" "Found her dying in the road," Elijah said. Miller sighed. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "The problem is, miss, it is your word against his, and he has papers. He has a warrant from Abilene. It might be a bought warrant, but it is a warrant all the same." "He is going to take me?" Clara asked, her voice whispering. Miller put his hat back on. "Not today. I do not like Henderson. I do not like men who hide behind money to hurt women. But I cannot just ignore a warrant. I need proof. If you can't prove he is lying, eventually a judge is going to sign an order. And then I will have to come back with deputies." He looked at Elijah. "Keep her here. Do not make me hunt you. I will give you a week to find something that clears this mess. Otherwise, you bring her to town for the hearing." Miller turned his horse. He paused, looking back at Clara. "For what it is worth, ma'am, I believe you, but belief does not hold up in court." He rode away. The silence he left behind was heavy. Clara sank onto the steps, putting her head in her hands. A week later, she whispered, "It is just delaying the end." Elijah looked at the dust settling on the trail. He looked at Clara, defeated, slumping her shoulders. A cold anger burned in his gut, but beneath it was a clarity he had not felt since the war. Strategy. "It is not the end," he said. He walked to her, crouching down. "You need justice." "Clara, safety is not enough." "How?" she asked, looking up. "We have nothing. We are nobodies." Elijah stood up. He walked into the cabin. He went to the loose floorboard under his bed and pried it up. From the dark earth beneath, he pulled a heavy canvas sack. He brought it out to the porch. He opened the sack. Inside were silver dollars, heavy and dull. His pay from the war, his savings from years of trading wool. It was everything he had. "I'm going to town," he said. Clara stood up, alarmed. "You cannot go there alone. Henderson will have his men. I am not going to fight him with guns." Elijah said, "I am going to fight him with the only thing men like that understand, leverage." He saddled the roan. He checked his pistol, tucked it into his belt, and mounted up. "Stay inside," he ordered. "Keep the door barred. I will be back by nightfall." He rode hard. When he reached the town of Silver Creek, he did not go to the saloon where Henderson was likely holding court. He rode to the edge of town, to the smithy. The blacksmith was a man named Silas, a free black man who had come west after the war. He was one of the few men in the territory who could look Elijah in the eye without looking up. He was pounding a glowing horseshoe, sparks flying in the dim interior of the barn. Elijah walked in. Silas stopped hammering. He leaned on his anvil. "Elijah," he said, "heard you got trouble." Elijah placed $5 on the anvil. The metal rang. "I need you to tell the truth. Silas." Silas looked at the coins, then at Elijah. "About what?" "About the day Henderson rolled into town last autumn. About the girl you saw crying in the back of his wagon when he stopped to get a rim fixed. You told me once you didn't like the way he treated his stock. I am betting you didn't like the way he treated that girl either." Silas wiped his hands on his apron. "I remember. He slapped her, right out in the open, because she dropped a needle." "Will you tell the judge that?" Elijah asked. Silas looked at the money. "I don't need your coin to tell the truth." "Elijah?" "But Henderson, he owns half the council." Elijah placed another stack of coins on the anvil. It was a small fortune. "Then let's buy the other half," Elijah said grimly. He spent the day moving through the town like a shadow. He found the washerwoman who had cleaned Henderson's shirts and heard him bragging about breaking the new girl. He found the stable boy who had seen Henderson lock Clara in the wagon. He did not threaten. He offered coins for lost time, and he offered his presence as a guarantee of safety. He was building a wall of truth, brick by brick. When he rode back to the cabin, the moon was high. Clara unbarred the door before he even dismounted. She ran to him, grabbing his leg as he sat in the saddle. "You came back," she sobbed. "I told you," Elijah said, sliding down. "We do not run." He told her what he had done. He told her about Silas. He told her about the washerwoman. He told her that the town was starting to talk. And for the first time, the talk was not about the whore in the mountains, but about the brute in the hotel. Clara listened, her eyes wide. "You spent your savings," she whispered. "Everything you worked for." Elijah took her hands. They were cold. "Despite the warm night, I spent it on the only thing that matters," he said. Clara shook her head. "I brought this to you. I brought danger. I felt ashamed. I cost you your peace. I cost you your money." Elijah pulled her to him. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. "Clara, look at me." She looked up. "Before you came, I was a ghost in this cabin," he said. "I chopped wood. I ate. I slept. I waited to die. I was serving a sentence for a crime I committed 10 years ago." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You gave me a reason to feel alive again. You gave me something to defend. I would spend every coin. I would burn this cabin to the ground before I let you go back to that darkness." Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pulled his head down and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce. It was a claim. "Take me inside," she whispered against his mouth. Elijah swept her up into his arms. He kicked the door shut behind them. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. He set her down on the buffalo robe, but he did not move away. He stood over her, his breathing ragged. The day had been a battle, and the adrenaline was still coursing through his veins. Clara reached up and unbuttoned his shirt. She pushed it off his shoulders, exposing the scars, the map of his pain. She ran her hands down his chest, her fingers seeking the heavy beat of his heart. "Make me forget him," she commanded. "Make me know that I belong to you." Elijah growled low in his throat. He did not ask for permission this time. The permission was in the fire in her eyes. He took her wrists and pinned them above her head. It was a gesture of dominance, absolute and overwhelming. But his eyes were wide open, locked on hers, promising safety in the surrender. He kissed her throat, her collarbone, the swell of her breast. He worshipped her body with a desperate intensity. He wanted to erase every touch that had come before him. He wanted to burn his name into her skin. Clara arched into him. Crying out, she let go. For the first time in her life, she let go of the control she had fought so hard to maintain. She trusted him to hold her. She trusted him to break her apart and put her back together. It was a lovemaking of exorcism. It was sweat and friction and the smell of wood smoke. It was Elijah's heavy weight pressing the fear out of her. It was Clara's nails on his back, anchoring him to the earth. When he finally entered her, she did not flinch. She wrapped her legs around him, pulling him deeper. I love you, she gasped, the words torn from her in the peak of release. Elijah buried his face in her neck. I have you, he rasped. I have you. They lay tangled together in the aftermath, the silence of the cabin no longer empty, but full. It was a heavy, sated silence. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to his heart slow. She traced the line of a scar on his arm. She felt different. The shame was gone, burned away by the heat of his possession. She was not a victim waiting for a verdict. She was a woman who had been claimed by a giant, and who had claimed him in return. Elijah kissed the top of her head. His arm tightened around her. Let them come, he whispered into the dark. We are ready. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a deputy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else than standing in the shadow of Elijah's cabin. The paper was heavy, the ink thick and official. It bore the seal of the circuit judge, Honorable Calloway, a man known as much for his love of fine brandy as for his loose interpretation of the statutes. The hearing was set for Friday. Henderson had played his final card. He had not brought guns this time. He had brought gold, and he had poured it directly into the pockets of the law. Elijah read the paper in the morning light, his face a mask of stone. He did not crumple it. He folded it with terrifying precision and placed it in his pocket. We go, he said. The ride to Silver Creek was a funeral procession of two. The mountains, usually a source of shelter, felt exposing. The sun beat down on the trail, kicking up dust that coated the back of Clara's throat. She rode Mayfly, the brown mare, her posture rigid. She had taken the gray dress from the bottom of her trunk, the dress she had worn the day she ran, the dress that smelled of the merchant's wagon. She had washed it, scrubbed it with lye until the fabric was thin, but putting it on felt like stepping back into a cage. Elijah rode beside her. He had left the rifle in its scabbard, but the Colt Navy revolver at his hip was freshly oiled. He scanned the ridgeline, the trees, the shadows of the rocks. He was not a man going to a legal proceeding. He was a soldier marching into enemy territory. If the judge is bought, Clara said, breaking the long silence, what happens then? Elijah did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. If the judge is bought, he said, his voice flat, then the law has failed. And if the law fails, we leave. And if they try to stop us? Elijah turned to her then. The look in his eyes was not the gentle gaze he reserved for the firelight. It was the look of the storm. Then I will make them wish they had let us go. They arrived in Silver Creek just past noon. The town was buzzing. Word had spread. The giant from the High Valley and the runaway seamstress were coming to answer the merchant's charges. People stood on the boardwalks, watching. Women peered from behind lace curtains. Men leaned against the posts of the saloon, chewing tobacco and spitting into the dirt. Clara felt their eyes. She felt the weight of their judgment. To them, she was a curiosity, a scandal. She lifted her chin. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She gripped the reins until her knuckles were white, staring straight ahead at the courthouse doors. The courtroom was a stifling box of trapped heat and unwashed bodies. It smelled of stale sweat, sawdust, and the cheap cologne favored by Judge Calloway. The judge sat behind a high oak bench, his face flushed and shiny. He dabbed his forehead with a silk handkerchief, looking bored and irritated. Henderson sat at the plaintiff's table. He wore a new suit, dark blue wool that looked expensive and hot. He did not look at Clara as she entered. He shuffled papers, whispering to a thin, weasel-faced lawyer he had brought from the city. Elijah guided Clara to the defendant's bench. He did not sit. He stood behind her chair, his back to the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He loomed over the room, a silent, threatening presence that made the bailiff nervous. The proceedings began with the drone of the lawyer. He painted a picture of Clara as a deceitful, loose-moraled woman who had taken advantage of a charitable businessman. He spoke of debts unpaid, of theft, of a breach of contract. He used words like harlot and ingrate, casting glances at the jury box, which was empty, for this was a hearing before the judge alone. Calloway nodded along, his eyes glazed. It was clear to everyone in the room that his mind was made up, likely swayed by the envelope Henderson had passed to him the night before at the hotel. Then, it was time for the witnesses. Henderson took the stand first. He performed well. He feigned sorrow. He claimed he only wanted to help the girl, that he had treated her like a daughter, and she had repaid him by robbing his lockbox and fleeing into the night. Clara sat still, her fingernails digging into her palms. Every lie was a lash. When it was Elijah's turn to present a defense, he did not hire a lawyer. He simply nodded to the back of the room. Silas, the blacksmith, stood up. A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd. A black man testifying against a wealthy white merchant was rare and dangerous. Silas walked to the front of the room, his leather apron left at the forge, wearing his Sunday best. He took the oath with solemn dignity. "Tell the judge what you saw," Elijah said from his standing position. Silas looked at the judge. "I fixed a wheel for Mr. Henderson last October. He rumbled. He was in a hurry. The young woman was in the back of the wagon. She was sewing. She dropped a spool of thread. It rolled out the back." Silas paused, looking directly at Henderson. "Mr. Henderson stopped the wagon. He did not ask her to pick it up. He climbed in the back and he struck her, open hand, across the face, knocked her into the canvas. Then he grabbed her by the hair and told her she was clumsy property." "Objection," Henderson's lawyer squeaked. "This is irrelevant to the charge of theft. It goes to character," Elijah said. His voice cut through the room like a blade. Judge Calloway looked at Silas, then at the crowd. The townspeople were whispering. They knew Silas. He shod their horses. He fixed their plows. He was a man of few words and iron truth. Overruled. Calloway grunted. "Continue." Silas finished his testimony, recounting the fear he had seen in Clara's eyes. When he stepped down, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air was less stifling, charged with a sudden, sharp attention. Sheriff Miller took the stand next. He looked tired. He looked at Henderson with open dislike. "Did you find any stolen property on the girl?" Calloway asked, leaning forward. "No, Your Honor," Miller said. "When the accused arrived at the cabin, she had no shoes. She had one dress. She had no money. If she stole $300 and a gold watch, she hid it in the sagebrush and forgot where she put it." Henderson stood up, his face reddening. "She buried it. She is a cunning witch who—" "Sit down, Mr. Henderson." Calloway banged his gavel. The merchant sat, but his composure was cracking. The heat, the staring crowd, the undeniable weight of the testimony were chipping away at his facade. Finally, Clara stood. She walked to the witness chair. She did not look at Elijah for strength. She found it in the wood of the floorboards, in the memory of the cold nights she had survived, in the knowledge that she had already walked through hell and come out the other side. "State your name." The judge said, "Clara." She said, she took a breath. "I did not steal from that man. I ran from him because he told me that my body was the only currency he would accept for a debt I did not owe." The courtroom went silent. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. "He had me arrested in Abilene because I would not let him into my room," Clara continued, her voice shaking but growing louder. "He planted the watch. He told me he would make the charges go away if I submitted to him. He told me I was nothing, that I was broken." She turned her head and looked directly at Henderson. "I am not broken, and I am not yours," Henderson snapped. The mask fell away completely. He jumped to his feet, his face twisted in an ugly, purple rage. "You lying little whore!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "I bought you! I paid your bail! You belong to me!" The courtroom erupted. The admission hung in the air, stark and undeniable. He had claimed ownership, not debt. Judge Calloway's face went pale. He looked at the crowd, which was now shouting in anger. He looked at the sheriff, who had his hand on his gun. He looked at Elijah, who had pushed off the wall and was standing ready to tear the room apart. Politically, Calloway was a survivor. He knew when the wind had changed. "Order," he bellowed, hammering the gavel until the handle nearly snapped. "Order in this court." He glared at Henderson. "Sit down, sir, or I will hold you in contempt. Henderson stood panting, realizing too late what he had done. He sank back into his chair, but the damage was absolute. Calloway cleared his throat. He shuffled his papers, looking for a way to salvage his dignity. Given the testimony of the blacksmith, the lack of physical evidence presented by the sheriff, and the outburst of the plaintiff, this court finds the charges of theft to be unsubstantiated. He banged the gavel once. Case dismissed. The defendant is free to go. A cheer went up from the back of the room. It was not the whole town, but it was enough. The washerwoman was clapping. The stable boy whistled. Clara sat in the witness chair, stunned. It was over. The gavel had come down, and the sky had not fallen. Elijah walked to her. He offered his hand. She took it, her fingers cold and trembling, and he pulled her to her feet. "Let's go home," he said. They walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for them. They stepped out of the courthouse into the blinding afternoon sun. The air tasted sweet. Henderson came out a moment later. He was followed by his hired men, but they looked sheepish, keeping their distance. Henderson was not sheepish. He was humiliated, and humiliation in a man like him turned instantly to violence. He saw Clara standing by the hitching rail, adjusting her saddle. The sight of her, free, unbowed, belonging to herself, was more than he could bear. "You think you won?" he snarled, rushing toward her. He raised his hand, the same backhanded strike Silas had described, aiming for her face. Clara flinched, old instincts flaring, but the blow never landed. Elijah moved with the terrifying speed of a grizzly bear protecting a cub. He caught Henderson's wrist in midair. The sound of the impact was a dull thud of meat against bone. Henderson gasped, his eyes widening as Elijah's grip tightened. The giant twisted the merchant's arm, forcing him to his knees in the dirt of the street. Elijah did not stop there. He shoved Henderson face first into the dust, pinning him with a knee to the center of his back. The hired men stepped forward, hands going to their guns. Sheriff Miller stepped off the boardwalk, a double-barreled shotgun resting casually in his hands. "I wouldn't," the sheriff said. The hired men froze. Elijah leaned down, his mouth inches from Henderson's ear. The merchant was sputtering, spitting dirt, struggling uselessly against the crushing weight. "She is not yours," Elijah growled. The words carried to every person watching on the street. She never was. He stood up, releasing the man. He stepped back, dusting off his hands. "If you come to my valley again," Elijah said, looking down at the heap of fine blue wool and malice, "I will not bring you to the judge." He turned his back on Henderson. He took Clara by the waist and lifted her onto Mayfly. He mounted his own horse, the leather creaking in the silence of the street. They rode out of town. No one spoke. The neighbors watched them go, and while some still whispered, clinging to their prejudices, many others looked at the straight-backed woman and the giant cowboy with a new, grudging respect. The ride back to the homestead was long. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the trial drained away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The sun dipped below the peaks, casting long shadows across the trail. They rode through the twilight, the silence between them no longer tense, but weary and comfortable. When they reached the cabin, the moon was already high. The valley was bathed in silver light. The structure looked small against the vastness of the night, but to Clara, it looked like a fortress. It looked like home. Elijah tended to the horses, rubbing them down with extra care, feeding them an extra ration of oats. Clara went inside and lit the lamp. She did not start a fire in the stove. The air was warm enough. She sat at the table, staring at the flame, her mind slowly catching up to the reality of her freedom. Elijah came in. He washed the dust of the town from his face and hands in the basin. He looked at her, water dripping from his beard. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "No," she said. "I am just empty, but in a good way, like a room that has been swept clean." Elijah nodded. He sat opposite her. He reached across the table and took her hand. "It is done," he said. Clara looked at their joined hands. "It is done." They sat there for a long time, letting the peace settle into the corners of the room. Then, slowly, the conversation turned to the future. For months, they had lived day to day, surviving the winter, surviving the threat. Now, there was a tomorrow. "We should plant wheat in the lower pasture," Clara said suddenly. "The soil is good there. I saw it when the snow melted." "Wheat," Elijah mused. "I have not planted crops in years, just enough for the horses." "We need more than horses," Clara said. "We need to put down roots. Real roots." She hesitated, then spoke what was on her mind. "I heard in town about the wagon that burned on the North Ridge last week. The Miller family." Elijah's face darkened. "I heard cholera took the parents. The wagon caught fire from a neglected camp stove. They said there was a boy," Clara said softly. 7 years old. He is staying with the person, but the person has no room. They are looking for someone to take him." Elijah looked at her. He saw the look in her eyes, not pity, but recognition. She knew what it was to be left behind. "A boy needs a father," Elijah said, "not a hermit who forgot how to speak to people." "He needs a home," Clara corrected. "He needs a place where no one will hurt him." "We have a home, Elijah. We have space." Elijah was silent. He thought of the boy in the war, the one he had killed. He thought of the guilt that had driven him to this solitude. Then he looked at Clara, the woman he had saved, the woman who had saved him right back. Maybe redemption was not about forgetting the dead, but about caring for the living. "We can go see the person next week," he said quietly. Clara smiled. It was a tired, beautiful smile. The lamp burned low. The shadows stretched across the floor. Clara stood up and walked around the table. She stood between Elijah's knees, her hands resting on his shoulders. Elijah looked up at her. His eyes were unguarded, full of a love that terrified him with its intensity. Clara ran her fingers through the hair at the nape of his neck. "I have never said it," she whispered. "What?" "I have never said I love you to a man. Not once. My father died before I could speak. The men I met later, they did not want love. They wanted obedience." She swallowed, her throat tight. "I was afraid that if I said it, it would give you a power over me that I could not take back." Elijah reached up and placed his large hands on her waist. His thumbs rubbed circles against the fabric of her dress. "You have the power. Clara, you have always had it." He pulled her closer until her body was pressed against his chest. "Say it," he murmured, "but say it slowly. Say it with your hands." Clara blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the red glow of the embers in the hearth. She straddled his lap, her skirts bunching around her waist. She felt the solid warmth of him, the anchor of his body. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear, her hands sliding down his chest to rest over his heart. "I love you," she whispered. She kissed the pulse point in his neck. "I love you," she said again, against his skin. She pulled back to look at him in the dying firelight. His face was open, raw, beautiful in its ruggedness. "I love you, even when it hurts," she vowed, her voice breaking with the weight of the truth. "Especially when it hurts." Elijah let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He pulled her down to him, kissing her with a desperation that spoke of a lifetime of loneliness finally ending. He carried her to the bed. They did not undress with haste. They undressed each other with the slow, deliberate reverence of people who knew that they had all the time in the world. When they made love, it was different than before. It was not just a claim. It was a conversation. It was a shedding of the armor they had both worn for so long. Clara moved with him, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body arching into his touch. She felt the scars on his back, the history of his pain, and she pressed herself against it, absorbing it, sharing it. There was dominance in the way he held her hips, guiding her, his strength surrounding her, but there was surrender in the way he looked at her, his eyes wide and vulnerable, seeing nothing but her. They moved together in the firelight, two broken things forging something whole. It was raw, it was messy, It was full of tears and sweat and the breathless, shattering release of two souls finally coming home. Later, as they lay tangled in the buffalo robe, the fire popped softly. Clara rested her head on Elijah's shoulder, her hand flat on his chest. She felt the steady thrum of his heart beneath her palm. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind outside. It was just wind now. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a threat. It was just the world, moving on, while they lay safe in the center of it. "We will plant the wheat," Elijah rumbled in the dark, his voice sleepy and content. "Yes," Clara whispered. "We will plant the wheat." And she fell asleep, dreaming of golden fields and a boy with dusty knees running through them, and the giant who stood watch over it all. Spring arrived in the high valley not as a guest, but as a conqueror. It broke the back of the winter with a violence of color and sound that startled the earth into waking. The gray ice that had choked the creek for months shattered, sending water roaring down the granite bed, clear and cold enough to stop a man's heart. The silence of the snow was replaced by the frantic industry of life, the drumming of woodpeckers in the pines, the shriek of hawks circling the thermals, and the steady, rhythmic thud of Elijah's hammer against new timber. The cabin, once a squat fortress against the cold, was expanding. Elijah had spent the last of the winter felling cedar trees on the north ridge, dragging them down through the snow with the help of the roan mare. Now, he was framing a lean-to against the western wall, a proper shelter for the firewood and the tools. He had also stripped the old, rotting bark from the roof and was laying down new, hand-split shakes that smelled of resin and fresh sap. Clara stood in the yard, shielding her eyes against the brilliance of the sun. She held a basket of wet laundry, the sheets heavy and white. She watched Elijah on the roof. He moved with a careless grace, his boots gripping the pitch, his shirt stripped off in the midday heat. His back was brown from the sun, the scars that had once looked so angry now fading into silver lines that mapped a territory he no longer lived in. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm, and looked down. He saw her watching him. He did not smile. He was still Elijah, after all, but his eyes softened, crinkling at the corners. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, of the day, of the life they were building. Clara smiled back, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. She turned to the clothesline Elijah had strung between two aspen trees. As she pinned the sheets, the wind snapped the fabric, a sound like a sail catching a breeze. Life had filled the empty spaces of the homestead. A milk cow, a placid Jersey with eyes like liquid amber and a temperament to match, grazed in the lower pasture. Elijah had traded 3 sacks of high-grade wool for her in town. They called her Bessie, mostly because she refused to answer anything else. 6 red hens scratched in the dirt near the new coop, clucking with self-important busyness. But the greatest change was in Clara herself. The hollow-cheeked girl who had stumbled into the dust was gone. In her place was a woman whose hands were rough from garden work, whose skin was kissed by the mountain sun, and whose spirit had taken root as deeply as the pines. That afternoon, a buckboard wagon rattled up the trail. It was the nearest neighbors, the Olsons, a Swedish family who lived 5 miles down the valley. Mrs. Olson, a round woman with a laugh that could crack a walnut, had brought her eldest daughter, Ingrid. Ingrid was 14, shy, with hair the color of straw. She held a bundle of fabric to her chest as if it were gold. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and welcomed them. Coffee was poured, strong and black, into tin cups. They sat on the porch, the sunlight warming the wood. "I hear you have the finest hand with a needle in the territory," Mrs. Olson said, nodding at Clara. "My Ingrid. She wants to learn, but my fingers are like sausages. I can cook a hog, but I cannot stitch them." Clara looked at the girl. She saw the hesitation in Ingrid's blue eyes, the fear of doing something wrong. It was a small fear, nothing like the terror Clara had known, but it was real. Clara set down her cup. "Come here, Ingrid." The girl approached. Clara took the fabric, a length of simple blue calico. She smoothed it over her knees. "Sewing is not about fighting the cloth," Clara said softly. It is about listening to it. The needle knows where to go if you let it. For the next 2 hours, the valley was filled with the murmur of women's voices. Clara taught Ingrid how to thread the needle without fraying the cotton. She taught her the running stitch and the back stitch. She guided the girl's hands, her own fingers gentle and patient. There was a moment when Ingrid pricked her finger. She gasped, pulling back, waiting to be scolded. Clara caught her hand. She looked at the tiny bead of blood. "It happens," Clara said, smiling. "The cloth demands a sacrifice sometimes. It means the dress will be lucky." Ingrid giggled, the tension breaking. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. For so long, her skill with a needle had been a chain, a way to pay off debts, a way to survive the merchant's demands. Now, it was a gift. It was something she could give away freely. She was reclaiming the thread of her own life, stitch by stitch. 2 weeks later, Elijah went out to check the fence line on the upper ridge. He took the roan and his rifle, riding out before the mist had cleared from the valley floor. He did not return at noon for the cold beef and bread Clara had set out. By mid-afternoon, Clara was pacing the porch. The old fear, the instinct of the hunted, never fully slept. It whispered that happiness was fragile, that men like Elijah disappeared, that the world was waiting to take back what it had given. Then she heard the horse. Elijah rode into the yard slowly. He was leading the roan, walking beside it. Behind him, tied to his saddle horn with a length of soft rope, was a creature that looked more like a bundle of sticks and mud than an animal. Clara ran out to meet him. "What is it?" Elijah stopped. He looked exhausted, his boots caked in mud, his shirt torn at the shoulder. Found him in a patch of bramble near the box canyon. Elijah rasped. Must have been separated from a wild herd. The mother was gone. Lion sign was fresh. He stepped aside. The creature hobbled forward. It was a foal, a colt with a coat that might have been chestnut under the filth. He was skeletal, his ribs showing through his hide like the rungs of a ladder. His legs were cut and swollen, wrapped in thorny vines that Elijah had cut away but which had left deep, weeping gouges. "He is barely alive," Clara whispered. Reaching out a hand, the foal shied away, rolling his eyes, trembling so hard he nearly fell. "He is a fighter," Elijah said. "He was tangled so tight he could not move, but he was still kicking when I found him. He bit me twice." Elijah looked at the colt with a strange expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "We have to put him down?" Clara asked, dreading the answer. Elijah shook his head. "No, we cut the rest of the thorns. We clean the cuts. We feed him. He wants to live." "Clara," I could feel it in him. They spent the night in the barn. They lit lanterns and worked in the golden haze of the oil light. Elijah held the terrifyingly strong, thrashing animal while Clara worked with tweezers and warm water. She pulled thorns from the soft flesh of his legs. She washed the mud from his flank. She spoke to him in a low, humming drone, the same way she had hummed to calm herself in the dark. By dawn, the foal was swathed in clean bandages. He was standing, drinking warm milk mixed with grain mash from a bucket Clara held. "He needs a name," Clara said, leaning her head against Elijah's shoulder. They were both sitting in the straw, too tired to move. Elijah watched the colt drink. The animal had survived the loss of his mother, the hunger of the predator, and the trap of the land. "Second chance," Elijah said. Clara looked at the giant man, seeing the boy he had killed in the war reflecting in his eyes, seeing the redemption he was finding in saving this small, broken life. Chance. She agreed. Spring turned to early summer. The wildflowers exploded across the meadows. Indian paintbrush, lupine, and columbine painting the grass in riots of red, blue, and yellow. One morning, a rider appeared on the trail. It was Silas, the blacksmith from town. He was driving a cart loaded with iron stock, but he turned up the drive to the cabin. Elijah met him at the fence. Clara stood on the porch, drying her hands on a towel. "Morning." "Elijah," Silas called out. "Brought you that hinge iron you asked for, and I have something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Sheriff Miller asked me to bring this up. Said it came in on the stage from the south. Elijah took the letter. He did not open it immediately. He thanked Silas, paid him for the iron, and they talked for a while about the price of nails and the weather. When Silas finally turned the cart around and rumbled back down the trail, Elijah walked to the porch. He handed the letter to Clara. "It is addressed to you." Clara took it. Her name was written in a heavy, flowing script. She recognized the seal on the wax. It was from the marshal's office in Tucson. Her hands shook slightly as she broke the seal. She unfolded the paper and read, "Dear Madam, this letter is to inform you regarding the man known as Josiah Henderson, following the warrant issued for his arrest in the Arizona Territory regarding fraud and the assault of a local woman of standing. Mr. Henderson was apprehended in the town of Nogales. He attempted to bribe the arresting officers and subsequently attempted to flee. He is currently in federal custody, awaiting trial. Given the nature of his crimes across multiple jurisdictions, it is the opinion of this office that he will not see freedom again. Regards, Marshal T. J. Peralta." Clara lowered the letter. The wind blew through the valley, rustling the aspen leaves. The sound was like applause. She looked out at the mountains. She thought of the fear that had ridden on her shoulder for a year. She thought of the man who had tried to own her. He was in a cage now. He was the one looking through bars. She did not cheer. She did not laugh. She felt a quiet, settling weight in her chest, like a stone finally finding the bottom of a river. Elijah was watching her, his face tense. "Clara?" She looked at him. A smile touched her lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of release. It was bittersweet, acknowledging the pain but letting it go. "He is gone." "Elijah," she said softly, "he is truly gone." Elijah let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the day he met her. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, and she buried her face in the rough cotton of his shirt, smelling the pine and the horse and the man. She was free. A week later, Elijah disappeared. He rose before the sun, while the cabin was still gray and cold. Clara heard him moving, heard the soft clink of the coffee pot, but she feigned sleep, knowing he valued his quiet mornings. But when she woke fully an hour later, he was gone. The roan was gone from the corral. His rifle was gone. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The note was on the table. "Back by sundown. Chores are done." It was brief. It was like him, but the emptiness of the valley pressed in on her. Panic, irrational and sharp, pricked at her. Was he tired of this? Was the domestic life too small for a man who had walked through fire? Has the silence finally become too loud? She forced herself to work. She weeded the garden until her fingers were stained green. She scrubbed the floor. She groomed Second Chance, who was growing stronger every day, his coat turning a rich, burnished copper. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its long slide toward the western peaks. Shadows stretched across the grass, long dark fingers reaching for the cabin. Clara sat on the porch steps. She watched the trail. "Please," she whispered to the empty air. "Please come back." And then, he was there. He did not ride in. He walked. He was leading the horse, which was laden with a fresh buck. He had gone hunting. That was all. He had gone to provide meat for their table. Clara felt foolish. She felt relief so profound it made her knees weak. She stood up as he entered the yard. Elijah tied the horse and walked toward her. He looked tired. There were circles under his eyes, and he walked with a heavy tread. But as he got closer, she saw a strange energy in him, a vibration that hummed beneath his exhaustion. He stopped at the foot of the steps. He looked up at her. He took off his hat, crushing the brim in his hands. "You are back," Clara said. Her voice sounded small. "I told you I would be," Elijah said. He dropped his hat on the step. He reached into his pocket. "I did not just go for the deer," he said. "I went to the high grove, where the ironwood grows. It is the hardest wood in the mountains. It does not rot. It does not break. Fire only makes it harder." He pulled his hand out. He held a small object between his thumb and forefinger. It was a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was carved from dark, dense wood, polished until it shone like obsidian. He had carved it with his knife, smoothing it with riverstone and sand. It was simple, unadorned, and indestructible. Elijah stepped up onto the porch. He stood close to her. He smelled of the high air and determination. "I am a man with blood on my hands. Clara," he said quietly, "I have nothing to offer you but this land and the work of my back. I am not a gentleman, but I am your man." He took her left hand. His fingers were rough, stained with walnut juice and earth. "You once asked me not to hurt you. I promised I wouldn't. Now I'm asking you something else." He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It was warm from his pocket. "You still want forever?" he asked. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at the man who had built her a world out of nothing but silence and strength. She thought of the merchant's diamonds, cold and sharp, and how they compared to this circle of wood that had weathered storms for 100 years before Elijah ever touched it. She looked into his storm-gray eyes. She did not scream. She did not jump. The feeling was too deep for that. It was a river that ran underground, vast and powerful. "Yes," she whispered. She stepped into him, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. "I do," she said against his heart. "I want forever." Elijah let out a ragged sigh. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off the ground, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the earth. That night, they did not sleep in the cabin. The air was warm, carrying the scent of sage and cooling stone. Elijah took the buffalo robe and the quilts out to the meadow, spreading them on the tall grass beneath the canopy of the heavens. There was no moon. The stars were a spilled bucket of diamonds, millions of them, bright and close enough to touch. The Milky Way was a smear of white light across the black. They lay together under the vastness. There were no walls to contain them. There was no roof to hide them. When Elijah touched her, there was no hesitation. There was no shadow of the past hovering over them. Clara did not flinch. She did not think of what had been taken from her. She thought only of what she was giving. She pulled him down to her. His skin was hot against the cool night air. "You are beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with awe. "I am yours," she replied. They made love with a slowness that defied time. It was not about hunger, though the hunger was there. It was about confirmation. Every touch was a vow. Every kiss was a seal. It was a reclaiming of the night, turning the darkness from a place of fear into a cathedral of joy. Clara lay back, looking up at the stars while Elijah moved over her, and she felt a tear slide down her temple into her hair. It was not a tear of pain. It was the overflow of a heart that was finally, completely full. She held him, feeling the heavy muscles of his back, the strength that he surrendered to her, and she knew that this was the victory. Not the court case, not the letter. This ability to be open, to be vulnerable, and to be unafraid. Summer bled into autumn. The aspen leaves turned to coins of trembling gold. The air grew crisp again, promising snow. But the fear of winter was gone. The cabin was tight. The larder was full. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin. She wore a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hand rested absently on her stomach, which was softly rounded, swelling with the new life that grew beneath her heart. Down in the corral, Elijah was working with Second Chance. The colt was nearly a year old now, strong and spirited, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. He wore a halter for the first time. Elijah did not break the horse. He did not force him. He stood in the center of the corral, holding a long lead line, talking in that low, rumbling voice. "Easy, son," Elijah said. "Trust the rope. It connects us. It does not bind you." The colt pinned his ears, dancing sideways, pulling against the line. Elijah gave him slack, waiting, patient as the mountain itself. The colt stopped. He looked at Elijah. He took a step forward, the rope going loose. Elijah reached out and stroked the animal's neck. Clara watched them, the giant man and the wild horse. Both of them healed. both of them learning to trust. She felt the baby kick, a flutter like a trapped bird. She smiled. A year ago, she had been bleeding in the dirt. A year ago, she had prayed for death. Elijah looked up. He saw her in the doorway, framed by the sturdy logs he had hewn. He saw her hand on her belly. He stopped what he was doing and walked to the fence. He took off his hat and wiped his brow, looking at her with a devotion that stripped him bare. "Are you all right?" he called out. Clara took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. She looked at the scar on the back of his hand as he rested it on the fence post. She looked at the ring on her own finger. She thought of the road. She thought of the cold. She thought of the pain. It hurt. She whispered to the wind, her voice carrying down to him. She smiled, and it was a smile that held the sun. "But now I love every inch." Elijah smiled back, a true smile that showed his teeth and crinkled his eyes. He turned back to the colt, but he kept one eye on the door, behind Clara. The fire popped in the stove. The kettle began to sing. A new life waited, one born not from survival, but from something fiercely earned. Love without fear. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and the snow, through pain and healing, to find a place where love can stand its ground. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Clara and Elijah's journey. Did their story resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where the land is hard but the hearts are true. I look forward to reading your thoughts in English in the comments section. Until next time, keep your fires burning.